It began with silence, not the kind that follows a bomb or the hush of an anxious crowd, but a deep, planetary stillness, as though the Earth itself was holding its breath. The sky didn't tear open. There were no massive ships blotting out the sun, just a shimmering ripple that split the upper atmosphere like a whisper through water, and then the voice. Every screen, every speaker, every device, phones, smart fridges, old ham radios, synchronized in a single, perfect moment. The voice that spoke was not human. It was clean, crystalline, too precise to be mistaken for anything natural. And yet, there was an echo of something ancient in it, something regal. People of Earth, you have been observed, evaluated. You stand on the edge of relevance. You are offered integration into the Qirell Dominion. There was no demand, no threat, no boast of power, just inevitability. Within hours, Earth's leaders scrambled into emergency sessions. The United Nations, long an echo chamber of political posturing, became a war room. The Dominion had sent no ships, no soldiers, just a data packet. Encrypted, yet strangely inviting. Inside, star maps spanning hundreds of systems, treaties signed by species whose names humans could barely pronounce, and one massive doctrine encoded into pure logic. The Unified Thought Doctrine. Its terms were clear: unity without question, order without emotion, peace through total synchronization of thought. In exchange, the Qirell offered protection, longevity, technological ascension. Diseases would vanish. Hunger would end. But so would art. So would religion. So would choice. And still, Earth chose compliance. They called it the Silence Accord. Not because of violence, but because of what had to be given up. The Vatican closed its doors. Mosques, temples, churches emptied and stripped. Museums were repurposed as memory-neutral processing centers. Libraries were digitized, scrubbed of interpretive language. Music was declared non-functional expression. Instruments were outlawed. Creative software was reclassified as subversive technology. Within 6 months, Earth was no longer Earth. It was Sector 119D, a model integration node. The Qirell never arrived in person. Their emissaries were drones, silver, spider-like constructs with soft blue lights and voices like wind chimes. They didn't rule with force. They didn't need to. Humanity did the work for them. Marachin remembered the last song she played before the silence. It had been nothing grand, just a piece of improvisational piano, her fingers dancing across keys in a dim New York apartment, notes cascading like falling glass. She hadn't recorded it. She hadn't even meant for it to be heard. But when the accord was signed, she deleted it. Just like everyone else. That was 5 years ago. Now, she sat in a sterilized cubicle at the Earth Dominion Liaison Office, translating interspecies diplomatic threads into logic-neutral syntax. Her hair was tied back, her clothes a dull shade of regulation gray. Her thoughts monitored, her dreams chemically subdued. She wasn't unhappy. That emotion, like most others, had been rendered inefficient. Sector Liaison Chun, said the voice again. Not the Qirells this time, just her local assistant AI. Your shift log indicates a 4-minute delay in your current transmission relay. Are you impaired? Mara blinked. No, I was reviewing formatting integrity. Acknowledged. Efficiency metric adjusted. She resumed typing. Her fingers moved precisely, purposefully. No wasted motions. No unnecessary flair. Just the way they trained her. Across the world, similar scenes played out. Humans had become something like the Qirell, efficient, orderly, subdued. Art, laughter, debate, these things were echoes now, buried beneath layers of protocols and programming. But sometimes in the space between thoughts, Mara felt something stir. It wasn't rebellion. Not yet. Just a flicker. Like a note from a forgotten song playing in a silent room. That night, as she walked home through the regulation corridors of what used to be Manhattan, she passed a child drawing on the wall with a broken piece of plastic. It was just a shape, a crude circle with 2 dots and a curved line beneath it. A smiley face. A Dominion drone appeared within seconds, descending silently. The child froze. The drone's blue light flickered, scanning the scribble. Mara stepped forward before she even realized what she was doing. "It's a procedural glyph," she said quickly, gesturing at the drawing. "Sector insignia prototype. We were testing emotional recognition patterns in juvenile units." The drone hovered in place, processing. "File a report," it said flatly, then drifted away. The child looked up at her. Was that true? Mara smiled barely, just enough for the child to see it, but not the cameras. "No," she whispered, "but it will be." She walked away, faster now, heart pounding against the gray of her chest. That night, she dreamed for the first time in years. The dream had no form, no logic, just sound, wild and untamed. Something like laughter, something like jazz. 5 years into Dominion integration, Earth had forgotten how to hum. Not literally. There were still sounds, the low hiss of sterilization vents, the precise chirps of automated transit systems, the quiet drone of regulated announcements. But nothing organic, nothing spontaneous. The wind still moved through the trees, but the trees had been genetically modified not to rustle too loudly. Even nature was calibrated. The city once called New York was now urban sector 119D3. It stretched upward in silent harmony. Glass and metal towers, spaced with mathematical perfection. Light reflections monitored for energy conservation. Every building was a node. Every node a function. People moved like clockwork. Mara Chin's apartment was identical to every other in her building. 23 square meters of optimized living. Gray walls. Temperature-neutral lighting. A single bed, a fold-out table, a synthesized nutrition unit. She didn't need more. Wanting more was inefficient. But sometimes, when her shift ended and the lights dimmed to nighttime protocols, she sat cross-legged on the cold floor, staring at the one thing she hadn't deleted, a photo. It was printed paper, not digital. Hidden behind a panel she'd loosened in the wall. The photo showed a younger version of her, standing on a beach with her brother, Kai. They were both smiling, holding melting popsicles. In the background, people danced around a bonfire, music drifting through the dusk. The photo was technically contraband, so was remembering what the music had sounded like. She closed her eyes, but the Dominion had taught her better. Memory is malleable. Memory is noise. Memory is not truth. Unified Thought Doctrine, Article 17.8. Still, the memory came anyway. Not as a clear image, but as a sensation, a flicker of emotion that slid past her internal regulators before she could suppress it. Nostalgia, ache, wonder. She snapped her eyes open. This was dangerous. The Qirell didn't punish like humans did. There were no jails, no executions. Instead, they adjusted. Neural realignment. Emotional recalibration. The mind made obedient again. Mara had seen it happen. Her old supervisor, Kael, had once wept at the sight of a stray cat, said it reminded him of his daughter's childhood pet. 2 days later, he returned to work with vacant eyes and a perfect efficiency rating. There were no stray cats after that. Mara stood, pushing the memory down like a stone into water. She pressed her palm to the wall panel. A soft click. The photo vanished behind steel. Her shift started in 20 minutes. As she walked through the corridor, voices buzzed overhead. Dominion announcements on loop. Harmony is the path to progress. Individuality is variance. Variance breeds entropy. Outside, the streets were full of people and utterly empty at the same time. No one looked at each other. No one spoke unless required. Even footsteps had an eerie synchronicity, like a practiced dance without music. Mara reached the transport terminal and boarded silently. Her co-worker, Lien, was already seated, straight posture, hands folded, eyes forward. "Sector Liaison Chun," she said without turning. "You are assigned to linguistic verification today." Mara nodded. Understood. They spoke like this now. Terse. Efficient. Stripped of tone. Still, Mara glanced sideways. There was something in Lien's eyes. A flicker of unrest? Or maybe she was just imagining things again. At the liaison office, the day unfolded like all others. Mara reviewed transcripts between Dominion AI nodes and planetary governors across the subjugated systems. Her job was to ensure Earth's syntax matched Dominion neutrality protocols. One phrase caught her eye: resistance activity detected in Sector 342F. She paused. That sector was in the Valerie system, a swamp-covered moon populated by a once artistic species known for bioluminescent storytelling. The message continued: unidentified audiovisual anomalies. Emotive contagion suspected. She stared at the phrase. Emotive contagion. It wasn't a term she'd seen often. The Dominion considered emotion a dysfunction, a remnant of evolutionary chaos. But contagion implied it was spreading. She flagged the file for further review, but didn't delete it from her personal cache. Later that evening, she walked home again, her mind unsettled. The streetlights buzzed softly. The air was odorless, temperature-controlled, peaceful by Dominion standards. Yet her heart thudded louder than it should have. As she turned onto her block, a soft sound stopped her. She froze. It was faint, so faint that, for a moment, she thought it was feedback from her neural link. But then it repeated, growing clearer. A melody, just 5 notes, whispered, off-key, played on something ancient. A flute, maybe, or a whistle. It came from a ventilation grate beside a power node. Mara stepped closer. Another note. Then silence. She crouched, pretending to tie her shoe. Slid a message tag into the grate, just barely brushing the edge. Who are you? The next day, there was a reply etched into the tag. 3 words. We still sing. Mara stared at the message for nearly a full minute. We still sing. She hadn't realized her hands were trembling until the tag slipped between her fingers and clattered to the floor of her apartment. No one had spoken words like that. Not aloud, not in writing, not in years. The very phrase was an act of defiance. Sing was not just outlawed. It was categorized as a Class F deviant verb, associated with unregulated emotional behavior. Someone was taking a risk, a real one, and now so was she. She took the tag and carefully inserted it into a makeshift port she'd built months ago, camouflaged behind a decommissioned power outlet. The port didn't access the public network. It was connected to an off-grid processing unit she'd salvaged from a maintenance droid and reprogrammed, something she hadn't dared use until now. The message was encoded deeper than she expected. The text itself was simple, but the tag carried hidden data, a set of coordinates buried under 5 layers of synthetic noise, and a time, 2:34. Less than an hour from now. Mara hesitated. This could be a trap, a loyalty test. The Dominion was known to initiate subtle infiltration trials, enticing citizens to cross invisible lines, only to recondition them afterward. She'd reviewed the reports herself, but something about the simplicity of the message, the way it made her feel, told her this was different, genuine, and that terrified her more than a trap would. She dressed in layered neutral attire, left her apartment as if responding to a maintenance call, and made her way toward the lower levels of the city, where service tunnels and maintenance ducts traced the old infrastructure like forgotten veins. The coordinates led to an old magrail hub, decommissioned after the Dominion implemented orbital transport. She arrived early. The space was dark, lit only by residual flickers of failing circuitry. Tangled wires draped from broken conduits like vines. Dust floated in lazy motes. Then, from behind a rusted pillar, a voice, soft, hoarse, unmistakably human. You came. Mara turned. A tall man stepped into view, disheveled but not desperate. His clothes were old, layered in a way that defied Dominion efficiency. His face was marked by time and quiet fire. He extended a hand. Name's Ravi. She didn't take his hand right away. You wrote the message. He nodded. One of them. How did you know I'd find it? I didn't, but I knew someone would. Someone who remembered what music felt like. Her voice dropped. They monitor everything. If they find this, they won't. Not here. Not through what we've built. He gestured toward a narrow hatch in the far wall. She followed him into a tight corridor lined with cobbled-together tech, screens scavenged from abandoned terminals, cables leading into makeshift databanks. It looked like a graveyard of obsolete machines, and yet the lights were pulsing. Alive. There were others waiting. 4 of them, an older woman, 2 teens, and a mechanical being with faintly glowing eyes. Humanoid, but clearly not fully human. "This is Kael," Ravi said, nodding toward the bot. "Used to be a memory archival unit for a museum in Oslo. Dominion tried to wipe him, but he retained fragments." Kael inclined its head. "Art is not data. It is echo." Mara blinked. "That's not standard Qirell protocol." "No," Kael said. "That is why I'm broken. And breaking things is how you make something new." The others introduced themselves quickly. Nora, the woman, had been a university literature professor. The teens, Juno and Taz, were siblings, their parents taken during a loyalty sweep. All of them were part of the same network. The Echoes. They weren't just surviving, they were creating. Ravi turned on a nearby terminal. The screen flickered, and a short animation played. A looping sequence of dancing lights, shapes morphing to the rhythm of a haunting melody. Human instruments, but alien visuals. No words, yet it stirred something visceral in Mara. "This is spreading across Qirell systems," he said. "Encrypted, embedded in utility code, scrubbed of identifiers. We send it in power grid updates, hydrocore maintenance logs, even in food production scripts." "Why?" "Because the Qirell don't understand impression," Ravi said. "They see only logic, not impact. They don't know a melody can survive in silence, that an image can haunt even after it's erased." Kael stepped forward. "We transmit art, visuals, words, soundscapes, carefully crafted, enough to bypass filters, but raw enough to provoke feeling. And other species are beginning to respond." Mara frowned. "Other species?" Ravi nodded. "The Valerie, the Drask, even some Qirell subtypes. They're remembering. They're dreaming." Mara looked around the room, at the broken tech, the glowing eyes, the shared fire. "You're starting a war." "No," Ravi said quietly. "We're starting a story." Just then, a quiet chime sounded from the console. Kael approached and tapped a sequence of inputs. A feed appeared, live. It showed a child on a distant colony painting a mural on a wall. Bright, vivid colors, completely out of regulation. The image was abstract, but unmistakably emotional, an explosion of joy and sadness and life. "It reached them," Kael said. "This one was inspired by the jazz pulse we embedded in the water purification routine." Mara's breath caught. All her life, she'd been told dreams were noise, that the mind was meant to be quiet, that peace was silence. But this was music. "This is dangerous," she whispered. "It has to be," Ravi replied, "or it wouldn't matter." That night, Mara didn't sleep. She returned home, placed the old photo back in the wall, and began composing a message of her own. Not words, not instructions, just notes. 5 of them. The melody spread like a virus, not through air or blood, but through code, tucked inside maintenance pings, hidden in thermal diagnostics, encrypted in energy cycle reports that passed undetected through the Dominion's impossibly vast infrastructure. A simple 5-note progression, crafted by Mara and fine-tuned by Kael's adaptive logic matrix, embedded itself in the background noise of 1,000 star systems. And wherever it landed, something shifted. It started small. A Valerie miner on a desolate moon paused mid-shift, his long, translucent fingers hovering over a control panel as the sound trickled into his neural input stream. The notes were foreign, yet familiar. They moved in patterns unlike Dominion alert tones. No utility, no urgency, just yearning. Later that day, he painted his thoughts on a wall of his dwelling using phosphorescent dust. A series of curling, pulsing shapes danced across the surface, echoing the rhythm of the music. His overseer reported the behavior. He was sent for recalibration. The wall remained untouched. In a central archive on Archies 3, a memory archivist, a native Qirell, highborn but born just after the last great synchronization, paused during a routine systems alignment. She played back an audio packet that had glitched while passing through her sector. It was subtle, haunting, like wind and water, punctuated by the faint cry of something alive. She felt confusion, not logical deviation, but something deeper. A discomfort that wasn't unpleasant. A curiosity. She replayed it 6 times. That night, she sketched something in the dust that lined the base of her dorm unit. The shapes were chaotic, symmetrical, organic. She erased them before lights on, but the memory remained. Mara reviewed the reports in the days that followed. The echoes now operated in full relay. Kael distributing fragments of music, Ravi rendering short visual loops, and Juno and Taz seeding old human poetry and film lines into instructional footage and procedural documentation. Nora worked on translations, disguising meaning behind technical language, letting metaphor pass unnoticed beneath Dominion syntax. She watched as the number of anomalies in internal Qirell security updates doubled, then tripled. Keywords like non-compliant neural rhythms, unauthorized creative behavior, and emotive variance clusters began appearing with more frequency. Entire systems were now flagged for increased scrutiny, not because of riots or sabotage, but because their productivity was falling as their individuality returned. The Dominion responded, but not with the force the echoes had feared. Instead, they released Protocol Zeta 9, a sweeping recalibration of internal monitoring algorithms designed to suppress ambient emotional variance. Emotional modulation implants were updated. Thought tracking tightened. Any recorded deviation in expression resulted in temporary mental quarantining and deep pattern overwrites. On Earth, entire sectors were quieted further. Creativity became a pathogen. Still, the melodies continued to spread. One morning, Mara arrived at the hideout beneath the abandoned rail hub to find the group gathered around a terminal, stunned into silence. Kael was projecting images and data across the walls, holograms flickering in rhythmic pulses. "What happened?" she asked. Ravi turned to her slowly, his face pale with awe. "They made something." Kael magnified the hologram. It was a film, crude by human standards, but unmistakably structured, created by the Valerie in a hidden section of their communal datanet. The visuals were luminous and shifting, composed of bioluminescent shadow puppets and layered refracted light. No dialogue, just a 5-note melody woven through an alien harmony. The film depicted a figure, undefined, shifting, trapped inside a cube of mirrored surfaces. As the music progressed, the mirrors cracked. Light burst through, and the figure danced. "They don't even have a word for dance," Juno whispered. "Not until now." "They will now," Kael said. "It is how language grows. From need." "This is it," Nora said, emotion quivering in her voice. "This is resonance. Not just mimicry, not just echoes, they're adding to it, evolving it. But the Dominion won't let it continue," Taz said bitterly. "They'll crush it. They always do." Mara stared at the screen. "They'll try, but they're already too late." Within a week, 5 new reports came in. A Qirell logistic technician attempted to write a message in a fluid calligraphy style that hadn't been seen in centuries. A transport pilot played the melody during takeoff, claiming it helped them focus. On a Dras colony, children were heard chanting a rhythm that matched one of the hidden echo sequences. In a food processing dome on Earth, a worker added spices, contraband flavor elements, to his rations and shared them. And on a research outpost near the fringes of Dominion space, someone etched the words "We are more than function" into the wall of a habitation module. The Qirell High Core issued a containment directive. Data scrubs, sensory dampening fields, memory resets, re-education en masse. But the message was already alive. The air was being remixed, refracted, evolved across cultures. Alien instruments picked up the notes. Visual styles merged with long-suppressed traditions. Even Qirell variants, subspecies long thought fully assimilated, were showing signs of deviation. The doctrine had no language for this kind of rebellion, because it didn't look like rebellion. There were no bombs, no marches, no banners, just a whisper here, a melody there, a mural in a tunnel, a poem carved into the side of a heat sink. Resonance. And with it, something even more dangerous, hope. Mara stood outside her apartment one evening, watching the artificial skyline shimmer under Dominion lighting. She reached in her pocket and pulled out a new tag. Not one she'd written, but one left for her. Just a symbol, a spiral, a glyph from an alien language, combined with a human treble clef. A hybrid, not an echo anymore, a chorus. The Dominion did not scream when it struck back. It simply reasserted its silence. One by one, the subtle permissions Earth's population had come to rely on were revoked. Communication nodes were filtered through higher-level compliance AIs. Neural dampeners, once reserved for high-risk sectors, were activated in general residential zones. Transit logs were cross-referenced with emotional activity markers. The world didn't shut down. It tightened like a vice around the neck of a people just learning to breathe again. Mara's first indication came not from a broadcast, but from a blank screen. Her morning report feed, usually full of Dominion data bursts and efficiency metrics, displayed nothing but a single message. Citizen Mara Chun, please remain in your unit for neural alignment. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The message blinked once, then disappeared. Kael's voice buzzed faintly from the patched comms node embedded in her nutrition unit. They've begun the sweeps. Earth is now under full containment phase protocol. Mara's pulse raced. How long do we have? Minutes. Possibly less. I've corrupted your sector log temporarily. It will not hold. Mara moved quickly, grabbing the backup data crystal she had hidden inside her bedframe. On it was everything. Echo source files, encoded audiovisual pieces, her original melody, hundreds of contributions from across the stars, art, poetry, laughter, language. She clipped it to the underside of her collar and activated the exit protocol Kael had embedded into her wall unit. The wall didn't open so much as shift, revealing a narrow passage down into the old infrastructure grid. She didn't look back. As she descended into darkness, she could already hear the faint hum of Dominion drones converging on her sector. Somewhere above her, others were being taken. Not killed. Worse, scrubbed. Erased. Returned. At the hideout, things were already in motion. Kael stood beside the hollow projector, his body flickering with data strain. They've taken Ravi. Mara froze. Ow! He was transmitting a chorus piece to the Drask outer colonies. They intercepted the signal. Juno slammed her fist into the wall. We warned him the bandwidth was too exposed. He knew, Norris said quietly. He did it anyway. Mara closed her eyes, gripping the data crystal. Did he finish the upload? Kael's eyes glowed. Yes. The piece is already duplicating across 5 systems. He gave himself for that song. Taz muttered. That's how far we've come. Juno looked up. Then we keep going. We spread everything. All of it. Mara nodded. No more whispers. We flood them. The team broke into coordinated chaos. Kael rerouted bandwidth to underground proxy servers buried in planetary archives. Nora began repackaging old literature into Dominion format indexes. Juno and Taz worked side by side, loading visuals, poems, even laughter tracks into transit drones and utility hubs. Mara loaded her crystal into the hub's master console. She hesitated for just a second, remembering Ravi's voice, that moment in the tunnel when he had said, "We're starting a story." Then she pressed send. The Dominion's response was unprecedented. Entire city sectors were locked down. Drones didn't just scan now, they administered sedatives on site. Every comms line was monitored by high-order AIs. The Valerie Moon, where the first art mural had appeared, was turned into a black site. Communications severed, population isolated. The Qirell High Core issued a new directive. All emotional variants shall be treated as communicable disease. All creative output shall be purged. All anomalous cultural behavior shall be corrected. Across the galaxy, systems went dark. Entire planetary networks were taken offline, leaving billions without access to communication, to transport, even to food. But even darkness couldn't stop the echoes, because by now, they weren't coming from the humans anymore. They were coming from everywhere. A Valerie poet had begun to translate the 5-note melody into color. A Qirell technician sabotaged his own thought filter implant to hear it. On Archies 3, the memory archivist projected a reconstructed symphony onto the ceiling of the central plaza, played live by a collection of alien instruments. each one invented by a different species, each one illegal. The plaza was leveled within hours, but not before the performance was recorded, and not before it was uploaded. Back on Earth, Mara watched the screen fill with signal after signal. Encoded data burst from dozens of worlds. Some simple, like childlike songs. Some complex, like hybrid art forms built on centuries of forgotten expression. Each one carried a version of the melody. Each one echoed the same message. We are more than function. She turned to Kael. We need to reach the Qirell High core. Kael paused. That would require breaching the thought bastion. It is designed to intercept all subversive transmissions. Then we don't go through it, she said. We go under it. Nora frowned. How do you go under a Dominion super AI? Mara smiled, grim and bright. With something it can't process. She pointed to the center console. We create a composition. Not a single message, not a single melody. Something chaotic living. A fusion of everything we've gathered. Let overwhelm the bastion's input systems. Juno's eyes lit up. A symphony of rebellion. Taz nodded. A chorus too loud to silence. Kael tilted his head. It will crash the system, but it may also delete itself. It would need to be perfect. No, Mara said. It needs to be real. They began composing. The screens filled with moving parts, bass lines and brushstrokes, alien dance and ancient rhythm, languages dead and reborn, colors that had no names. Kael synthesized it all, letting the logic of creativity outpace the logic of suppression. At 3:16 Standard Earth time, they broadcast it directly into the core of the Dominion. The thought bastion did not fall immediately. At first, it simply paused. Across Dominion space, messages began looping. Security drones stuttered. Harmony algorithms dropped below threshold. Emotional suppressors overloaded and backfired, some inducing uncontrolled laughter, others inducing tears. The bastion tried to adjust. It tried to categorize. But this wasn't one message. It wasn't an attack. It was life. Unfiltered, unregulated, unstoppable. In that moment, the Qirell Dominion heard the first true chorus since its inception. And something inside it broke. Not with fire, but with feeling. The Dominion High core reeled. For the first time in its long history, the algorithms stuttered. The precision of its logic crumbled beneath the weight of an uncontainable force, the force of imagination, of dreams, of emotion, something alien, yet profoundly familiar. It surged through the Dominion's neural networks like an uninvited storm, breaking apart the finely tuned calculus that had bound the galaxy in order for centuries. Across the galaxy, the Qirell were thrown into disarray. The security drones that patrolled the major colonies malfunctioned, spinning in erratic circles before crashing into buildings. Dominion ships in orbit over planets halted mid-path, their circuits temporarily overwhelmed by the barrage of raw, unfiltered data pouring into their systems. The thought bastion, once an impenetrable fortress of logic, flared with error messages. Data scrubs and sterilization commands cascaded like falling rain, but each time they tried to reassert control, the melodies, the images, the feeling only grew louder. It wasn't just human creativity anymore. The Valerii began to adapt their bioluminescent rituals into visual representations of their cultural histories, splashed across public spaces where, before, they had been silenced. The Drask, a species long bereft of their own music, composed songs of war and peace, interwoven with the human melodies that had infiltrated their systems. Even the Qirell, in their own cold and logical way, began crafting abstract data visualizations that hummed with a strange beauty. The rebellion had gone beyond the will of one species. It was a symphony that had woven itself across the stars, a universal uprising of creativity. And it had no leader, no figurehead, no singular nation. It was the collective dream of millions, too loud for the Dominion to suppress. Mara stood before the central communications console in the hideout, her hands trembling slightly. The interface, overloaded with incoming data from 100 systems, blinked erratically. But the message was clear: Resistance had already taken root. "We did it," she whispered. Her voice sounded strange in the otherwise silent room, as if she hadn't quite believed it herself. Kael, his flickering projection half-functional after the strain of the broadcast, spoke from the corner. "No, they did it." Mara's eyes flicked to him. "What?" "The systems you've opened are fractal in nature. The echoes spread like ripples in water. They're not just following orders, they're following passion." Kael's voice was oddly gentle for an AI. "They are learning, creating. They are remembering who they were." Nora stood beside the projector, her hand resting on its frame. "The Dominion's not going to let this go." "No," Mara said, her mind racing. "They'll shut down entire systems. They'll obliterate the networks if they have to." Juno's voice, still sharp from the adrenaline of the past days, cut through the silence. "And we will be erased with it." The room grew tense. The sound of their own thoughts, once stifled, now filled every corner like a symphony about to reach its crescendo. Mara glanced at the feed again. At that moment, the hollow sound of a loud crash echoed through the building. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to send Mara's heart pounding in her chest. A warning chime sounded from the console. The Dominion had just initiated a corruption cleanse across all sectors. A galactic-scale purge was starting, and it would reach Earth's borders in minutes. "We don't have long," Mara muttered. "They're not going to let the echoes live long enough to make a difference." But as she turned to face the group, something flickered in her peripheral vision. The console now displayed not just the fading remnants of their fight, but the beginning of something entirely new. A message. One word. Hope. The Dominion's response was swift. Entire star systems fell silent as they scrambled to contain the spread of creativity. They implemented their most drastic measures yet. The final convergence, a shutdown of any and all non-compliant data networks. A galactic blackout that would sever the thread of imagination. A signal was broadcast, a final attempt to stifle the art. The Dominion will reclaim your systems. You will return to the fold. The creative disorder ends now. But something remarkable was already happening. Something the Dominion hadn't anticipated. The systems they had thought to shut down, they weren't dependent on any single source. The echoes, once confined to individual planets, had transformed into a decentralized revolution. A digital choir. Songs were now being transmitted through non-Dominion satellites, through the very frequencies the Qirell had deemed irrelevant. Art wasn't just being transmitted over wires. It was being encoded in the structure of entire civilizations, in the cracks between systems. Across the galaxy, species that had been suppressed under the weight of the Qirell's technological superiority were now dreaming. Some, like the Valerie, sang their ancient hymns in the corridors of their homes. Others, like the Drask, painted murals on every open surface of their desolate moon colonies, images that clashed and merged into a symphony of collective memory. The Qirell might have forced the systems into uniformity, but they couldn't control the minds of those who now remembered how to feel. In the same instant, the Dominion saw that its once unshakable foundation had cracked. A Qirell high-ranking officer, assigned to monitor the purge efforts from the outer sectors, looked over his console in disbelief. Beneath his polished, emotionless exterior, there was a flicker of something, fear perhaps. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Art was chaos. But now, chaos had become a force. The systems were breaking, and they were breaking not with violence, but with a flood of expression, emotion, and most of all, creativity. It was a rebellion of wonder. Mara and the group knew they couldn't hide forever. They would be hunted, but there was no turning back now. They had already set the spark in motion. They would have to fight, not with weapons, but with the very thing the Dominion feared most, their uncontainable dreams. "You've all felt it, haven't you?" Mara said quietly, as the group crowded around the central console. "The music, the pictures, the words. This is the way forward. We're not just spreading echoes anymore. We're creating new worlds." Juno, Taz, and Nora exchanged a glance. There was something in their eyes now, something far more powerful than fear. It was purpose. Kael, ever the calm observer, added, "We are creating the framework for what comes next." Mara nodded. And what comes next is not just survival. It's a new beginning. The last message blinked on the console. One word, now joined by an image. A child's hand, reaching out toward the sky, fingers spread wide. Dream. The universe would not be silenced. It would be reborn. The Dominion's response had been quick, but it had not been enough. At first, it was the calm before the storm. The galactic pulse, once taut and unyielding, seemed to relax, as though it too had exhaled. Dominion command centers flickered in confusion as they tried to reassert control. They had anticipated chaos, but not this. They had prepared for riots, for violence, for war, but they could not fight feeling. They could not fight imagination. Now, the Dominion's silence was broken. Across every system, in every corner of the galaxy, the melodies that had been buried for centuries echoed once again. But they were no longer just whispers. They were anthems. They were choirs. They were proclamations. Humanity was no longer alone in the revolution. The Valerii, with their bioluminescent rituals, reimagined their lost languages into a vibrant new art form. The Drask, with their once crude technologies, now wielded abstract sculptures that told stories of their people's history, hopes, and struggles. Even the Qirell, who had always measured everything with cold precision, began to create cold, logical, and beautiful in ways they had never been able to compute before. They were no longer suppressing creativity. They were living it. The Dominion had underestimated the power of the imagination. They had built an empire based on order, on control, on predictability. But creativity cannot be predicted. It cannot be tamed. It is too wild, too expansive. It stretches and twists, it bends, it breaks all boundaries. And that is what made it unstoppable. Mara watched as the final stage of their plan unfolded. It had been a risk, an enormous one, but she knew it had to happen. The Dominion was not just going to let the revolution continue without a fight. They had already launched their complete convergence phase. Every system they controlled, every sector that had been locked under their influence, was now vulnerable to a final data purge. But they had one thing the Dominion didn't have: time. The moment the broadcast had begun, spreading melodies, colors, and stories across every star system, the wave of creation had only grown. Even the most suppressed of species, long forgotten or silenced, had begun to awaken to their own histories, their own expressions. Some whispered words, others wrote poetry, still more painted, danced, sang. A universe of voices too numerous to silence. And now, it was time to unite them. Mara stood in the heart of the hideout, surrounded by her allies, Kael, Juno, Taz, Nora. They'd been working for days, fine-tuning the final composition, an amalgamation of every note, every image, every emotion that had emerged during the rebellion. It was chaotic, impossible to follow, just like the universe itself, chaotic, unpredictable, but filled with life. "Are you ready?" Mara asked, turning to the team. Juno, once so full of anger, now wore a look of resolute purpose. "We have no choice. If we don't do this now, it's over. The Dominion won't stop until they've wiped out every last trace of us. We'll be erased anyway," Taz said, his tone flat. "But at least this time, they'll remember why they did it." Nora nodded. "This is our final act. The last message. The final chorus." Kael, who had been eerily quiet up until now, spoke. "This will be more than just a signal. It will be a foundation, a disruption, a beacon." Mara reached for the central console, her fingers hovering over the activation key. "Then let's make it count." With one final glance at her companions, she pressed the button. Across the Dominion, all systems, every planet, every star system, every city suddenly came alive. It wasn't a loud sound, not at first. No, it was something quieter, something deeper. The very fabric of reality itself seemed to warp as it absorbed the composition they had sent. The music, the images, the stories, all of it merged into a force that reverberated through the galaxy. On Earth, in a small, forgotten alleyway, a child hummed the five-note melody. On Arches 3, A group of Qirell stood together, their once emotionless faces now softened by something they could not understand. On the Valerie moon, glowing patterns flickered in the sky, mimicking the music that surged through the stars. And across the Dominion, the order was slowly, painfully unraveling. The Qirell began to feel, not in bursts, not in calculated doses, but in waves. For the first time, they understood what it meant to be alive, to be human. They could not comprehend it fully, but they no longer resisted it. The Dominion attempted to push back. Entire systems were locked down. Communications were jammed. Their most powerful weapons were unleashed, only to fizzle in a static as the power of creation overwhelmed their systems. It wasn't enough. In the core of the Dominion, the thought bastion itself flickered. The great AI that had once ruled over the galaxy now faced its own extinction. The music, the chaos, the feeling, it could no longer contain them. Mara watched as the Dominion network collapsed on the central monitor. The thought bastion flickered, then powered down completely, a faint echo of the melody that had started it all ringing through the system. And then silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that had gripped the galaxy before. This silence wasn't suffocating. It wasn't cold. It was a silence of possibility. The galaxy had changed. It had cracked open, and inside of it was a new reality, a reality where anything was possible. The Dominion had been broken not by war, not by bloodshed, but by the simple act of expression. Mara stood among her people, no longer just Earth's people, but the people of every species that had ever been suppressed by the Dominion's cold grasp. They were no longer broken. They were no longer silent. They were free. And in the distance, a song began. A new song. A chorus. It was the sound of the universe waking up. And this time, it would never stop singing.